Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the daily edition of today's The Hindu newspaper, analyze the important articles for you which are relevant for your examination, be it for the prelims or the mains. While doing this newspaper analysis, we shall ensure that other than the various different aspects of the article, wherever required, we go into the depth and the detail as per the requirement of the examination as well, while at the same time ensuring that the noise associated and the unwanted areas of the article, that is something that we will ignore and extract the absolute crux out of it. We shall also be discussing two of the practice questions and discuss the art of answer writing and how to proceed with answer writing, because that is a very important aspect if you actually want to clear the examination and not just be one of the prelims achievers. So, without further ado, let us initiate the discussion. But before that, an announcement for all of you. Now, in order to have a better learning experience and in order to ensure that you get the various different educators on the platform and an ability and also an opportunity to gain vital information from them, that is why we have come up with the special learning series where today and tomorrow we shall be having special classes on our platform for across the various different areas and across the various different subjects. So do attend these free special classes and try to enhance your existing knowledge set. So in this, you can have the ability to chat live with our top educators. There will be interactive polls and ensure that all your doubts are cleared, so that with a relaxed environment at the same time, learning is something that can be enhanced. Now let us take a look at the topics. So today we are going to have a discussion for 8 different topics, 6 of them in slightly greater detail, 2 of them relevant for the prelims. So here, when we talk about these topics, we will discuss each one of them, starting with the first topic of the day. And the first topic of the day is the psychology of extravagance. Now, this is a topic which has appeared in the editorial section, and this is something which has appeared in page 6 of the newspaper, relevant for your IR or the portion of inequality, not IR, portion of inequality in your GS 3. So that is what this article is about, and that is where the relevance in GS paper is about for this article. Now, what does this article talk about? This article picks up from the very prominent and the popular media event which concluded recently, where you had the gala event in the form of the Ambani wedding. Now, that Ambani wedding not only did catch the eye of the global media and the global paparazzi as well, but you have to understand at the same time, it indicated opulence to the extremity. Opulence and extravagance to the extremity, which was something which was never observed or witnessed in India before. So this article talks about that psychology of extravagant opulence. That why is it that the wealthy end up spending so much? But here, while that is also something that we will understand, but we will also pay more attention to the fact of inequality, because for your examination from this particular portion, if anything can be asked, is about rising inequality, the impact, and what can be done going ahead in the future. But before that, very briefly about this psychology. Now, this article talks about and argues about the fact that when we talk about the inequality in our country, inequality is at a staggeringly high figure, where when we talk about the top 1%, that top 1% of the population has got 40 times the average, the possession in terms of wealth and money, so 40 times the average Indian. That top 1% has got the possession of it, right? Then when we talk about the middle 40 to 50%, right, middle 40% and then bottom 50%. Now, the middle 40% actually ends up possessing 0.1 times the national average and 0.7 times the national average. So here, the middle 40% has 0.7 times as compared to the average Indian, as compared to average Indian, whereas the bottom 50% has got 0.1 times possession as compared to average Indian. Right, now what do we make out of this? So basically, the inequality is very high. These figures indicate that. When you have 1% having so much and the rest 90% having very few amounts, so you will have thousands of people who are entering into the high net worth individual category. And this inequality gap is increasing in the country. Now, when you have the wealthy population, that is what the article argues, that look, the wealthy population have got a psychology, and listen to this carefully for the next 2 to 3 minutes. You will understand the psychology of the rich, which has been indicated at the same time, psychology of the average Indian or the average population who are trapped by that poverty scenario. So let us understand that and let us pay attention. First of all, when you talk about opulence or extravagance, now how the rich people behave in the society, that is always aspirational for the middle class in particular. Various different surveys have indicated that when you have rich people spending a lot, particularly the survey in US, now when rich people spend a lot, the other strata or the other sections of the society, they don't feel bad about it. They feel that, okay, they have earned their way into that particular position, so they have and they deserve the right to spend as they want. And that is where the opulence happens. And when you have that kind of a mindset prevalent in the society, that, okay, the rich people basically deserve the right to spend, the rich also develop a kind of a mindset that I have been here, I am in this position of wealth because of my own skill. Which might be true in certain cases, but in other cases it might be a sheer coincidence of lucky scenarios turning into their favor. So when the rich people, they gain that superior mindset or that superiority complex that we are here because we deserve it. So if we are here and we deserve it, we will spend as we like. So there is nothing objectively wrong in that entire mindset, but it perpetuates that wealth gap significantly further ahead. And that is why this article basically argues that when you take a look at the Ambani wedding, it was way out of ordinary. It was not a normal rich wedding which was there. It was a kind of an opulence to the next grandeur level, where everything was spent and no bars were left. So why was that? So here, the concept given by Veblen is cited. Veblen, in a nutshell, not repeating the verbatim of the concept of Veblen, but in a nutshell, understand it, Veblen had said that, look, if rich people spend X amount, the other sections of the society will aspire to spend that X amount. Let's suppose a rich person tomorrow drives a vehicle, a luxury vehicle. Now, different sections of the population, they will also aspire to drive that vehicle going ahead into the future to gain that social strata, to gain that social acceptance. Same is the case with clothes, wearables, everything. If the rich people, they wear a particular brand, other parts of the society also tend to wear the brand. But then there will come a situation where, let's suppose, you will have large number of population observing the similar kind of a lifestyle. They might also be driving in the luxury vehicles. They also might be wearing those clothes. For example, in India, you have a very fast rising middle class. Now that is why the sale of luxury vehicles, etc., that has become quite significant. Now, it is no longer the case that if you see a particular vehicle on the road, immediately you will be able to figure out that how rich or how poor that individual is. So, Veblen had suggested that ultra-rich people, they want to and they have the urge to spend to such an extent that it cannot be emulated by the society, so that the difference creator always exists. So that when you have the population, let's suppose, population who is trying to achieve them, aspiring to reach that position, even they cannot aspire, even the other rich people cannot aspire to reach that position, and that gap is created. So when the wealthy people develop that mindset of inculcating a gap between them and the other rich folk of the society, what will happen? A rampant growth of capital creation and a rampant growth of inequality shall always follow. And the poorer section of the society, while they will think that, okay, they deserve the right to be there, they have earned the right to be there, so they have the right to splurge as they want. Now, while that is okay, but when it comes to a developing country like India, a developing country where you have the requirements and the needs in various metropolitan cities in itself, where you have flooding, diseases, etc., which are quite rampant, in those times, this kind of a splurging mentality provides grievances to the other sections of the society as well. Other members of the society, other people of the society, they tend to develop the feeling that they are also working hard enough and they are not getting the desired result. That leads to a rising grievance level in the society and disharmonious conditions in the society. At the same time, the services within the society do not improve. After some time, what tends to happen, majorly in these kind of economies where the inequality is very high, the government, owing to the popular sentiments, starts taxing at a very high rate the rich. And as a consequence of that, there's a flight of capital. That is, the rich people, they tend to move out of the country. They abandon the citizenships, they move out of the country. So they will still continue to remain rich, but they won't be creating capital in the country anymore. So that is when the country moves from one particular spiral to another particular vicious condition. So we need to address the inequality. Having addressed the portions of the psychological impact of extravagance in the first and what the article has actually covered, now let us focus on the aspect relevant for your exam: rising inequality. Now, inequality in the society is on the rise, and it is rising across all the areas. When we talk about the income level, when we talk about the wealth possessed, there is a significant amount of gap. The Oxfam report released annually, that also indicates that the wealth gap is increasing. So this you can quote while writing the mains answer. That is the Oxfam report. Rising wealth gap. Wealth gap. Okay. Now, in this case, why is it that the wealth gap is rising? Why do we have the case where the income levels, they are having a significant amount of discrepancy? So, amongst the various factors, one of the factor is, if you take a look at the systemic development of Indian economy, then large population is involved in primary sector. When you talk about agriculture allied services itself, you have close to around 50% of the population involved there. And agriculture in our country is not a high yielding area of the economy. So agriculture overall manages to contribute only 14-15% to the GDP. And if you consider other such different types of primary sector activities, such as, let's suppose, mining, quarrying, etc., there the employment is very high. So large population is in primary sector. Primary sector is a low income, right? Low income sector. Then the manufacturing sector, in whichever country the manufacturing sector booms, in that situation, we have seen that in the case of Western Europe, we have seen that in the case of China, we have seen that in the case of North America. In whichever country the manufacturing sector booms, large sections of people find employment, ancillary and coexistent industries are created, and as a consequence of that, the overall income level of the society tends to increase very gradually. So a stymied manufacturing sector is also a reason for a large gap, that people are either in the primary sector and restricted to that, or they are in the services sector. Also understand, let's suppose in the same agricultural sector, if we would have lesser amount of population, what would have happened? Each one of them would have a larger share of income. Now, one of the failures of our economic development has been our inability to move people out of the agricultural area. So if lesser people would have been there, where would the rest have gone to? To manufacturing. But if manufacturing is not there, that is why they are restricted to it. So that means trap of a low income. So low growth of manufacturing. Then after that, one of the other cases of inequality, or the reasons for inequality that you can cite, is basically the aspect of lack of skills. Now, why do we have lack of skills? Is it the case that few people are born with a greater talent level? Absolutely not. The lack of skill is largely attributed to the very systemic failure which exists in the education system. And all of us, we are witness to that. That whatever is required in the market and whatever is being taught in the schools and the colleges, they are poles apart from each other. So that is why this lack of skills is because of the failure or the issues with the education sector. Education sector. Then, other than that, you also had a very discriminatory industrial policy long time back, and up till the 70s we had a kind of a license Raj system that also meant that you will always have the concentration of capital in few of the eligible hands. Rest of them are considered to be ineligible. So you had the concentration of capital happening since that point of time, and the capital has largely remained in those circles. Very rarely have we seen new capital being created or new wealth being generated. For example, let me cite an example for this. Let's suppose you consider the US. Now, US is a completely market-driven economy. Now, in US, when you talk about Bill Gates or Microsoft, when you talk about Jeff Bezos and Amazon, when you talk about Elon Musk and SpaceX or Tesla, now all of these individuals, they have created wealth on their own. Right, so that is a new wealth which is generated. And when people start creating wealth on their own, that is when they will have the ability to provide employment to a large section of the population. All of them can earn wealth. In our country, conversely, what you find as a trend is that you have few of the industrial houses since the time of pre-independence. Now, owing to some of the industrial policies and owing to some of our economic decisions and the policies thereafter, when we had the establishment of a newer industries, only certain people will be eligible to fulfill the criteria for establishment of newer industries because they already had the presence in that sector. So they had the expertise. For a new person to gain expertise and then gain a license, it would be a very cumbersome task. So that is why you have a lot of inherited wealth. Same is the case with China as well. And same is the case with India and the entire subcontinent. When you have inherited wealth, which is a large proportion, in that case, you have the restriction of that wealth, and that wealth does not percolate into the society. Right? Let's suppose you have a very successful industrialist. Now that industrialist has passed on the entire wealth to 2 or 3 of his sons and daughters. Now, as long as they are not generating further wealth, that wealth will stay with them. And they will come and they will go. The next generations will also basically use that wealth. So that is where you have the concept of lack of wealth generation, and here newer wealth generation. Wealth generation. Okay, for that what you need? New Google, Microsoft, Amazon, such companies to come up, and not only in services, maybe a new Maruti again. So such kind of companies to come up and capture the popular imagination, and thereby creating a new sector or a new avenue. But there are certain other reasons also for the rising inequality. What do you think is the reason why in India inequality is rising? So when you think about certain aspects and certain reasons different from these, put that in the comment section. Let us see who has got a better analysis of the portion of inequality. Now, what can be done? This inequality, rising inequality, is a significant and a major cause of concern. Why? Because it will always lead to social stratification. What is social stratification? Stratification is basically arrangement in various different layers. Right? When we say social stratification, the society in itself is divided into various different groupings. The haves, the have-nots. And when you have this division in the society, even let's suppose when you have to provide services from the side of the government, now that also becomes very difficult, because then you are unable to figure out who really deserves it and who is simply taking it off or benefiting or mooching out of it. So that is, social stratification always eventually leads to rise of grievances, aggrieved members of the society, and it can lead to social disharmony. Then other than that, if there is a very high level of inequality and the wealth is not percolating, there is a stigma of capital. Let me explain. Stigmatization of capital, that was elaborated in the economic surveys previously. What is that? Stigmatization of capital. It basically tells us stigma. Stigma means a negative feeling that you have or a negative thought process that you have. See, in our country you also have in certain parts, and still you have the prevalent mindset in popular society, is the fact that anybody who creates capital, that person is doing something which is not good. That person would have made capital by ulterior means. Right? So once you have that feeling develops, why does that feeling develop in the society? When a society for a very long period of time has this shared and lived experience that despite putting in all these efforts, our family or our entire community or our region is still at that position, but few people are doing good enough. Very few people are doing good enough. So in that case, there comes a rise of suspicion that there must have been some kind of connivance with the government, some unscrupulous activities due to which these people have made money. And when people take a look at the capitalists as they would have made money by nefarious means, immediately after that comes the aspect that you always take a look at these capital creators in a bad way. That is when the popular governments will impose high taxes, etc. So capital creation is looked down upon, and that is never good for the growth of the entire economy, because those who create capital, those who will be able to generate wealth, only they will be able to provide that employment, that will be able to create demand in the economy, that will further boost the economy in the coming years as well. So that stigmatization of the capital also tends to happen. Looking down on the capital creators, upon capital creators. Okay? Then eventually what happens? The government, owing to popular pressure, even nowadays, if you observe the kind of the social discourse, the public discourse that has been prevalent in our country for almost the past couple of decades has been what? That few industrial houses, they are having not being maybe taxed that much, or they are having a good time. Right, and that was the case in the 60s, 70s, 80s also. At that point of time, it was largely Tatas and the Birlas who were targeted. Now you have the Adanis, the Ambanis who have been targeted. But in the same case, in all the case, what is the pressure on the government? To impose more tax. And when you have more imposition of tax on the wealthy, that is when you have the flight of capital. They will leave the country, and you will have the other areas, let's suppose different regions, different jurisdictions like Singapore, etc., where they can generate that wealth. So that also means there can be flight of capital. Flight of capital. Now these are the macro impact, these two. Other than that, you see, people who have a very high net worth and who have significant amount of access as compared to the individual who is at the bottom strata of the society. Now, the person at the top will always have better access to the skills, better exposure, better availability of opportunities in order to enrich their professional skills as well. So the skill gap in the society continues to widen. And again, that is never good, because that means you are perpetuating that inequality in the future generation also, because the future generation will again have people who are well skilled and people who don't have that skill based upon their upbringing, right? So that is where you have the widening of the skill gap. Another aspect that you can link here to is the inefficiencies in the government services, because the government in this case, when you have almost 90% of the population or more, when you have that high amount of population restricting themselves to 0.7, or here we have seen basically 0.7, 0.1 times. So in that case, you will have what? The government services have to reach these many population, and that is when that government service will always be inefficient. So that is why here there will be inefficient government services. Inefficient government services. So these are the various different causes of concern, some of the important causes of concern due to rising inequality. So going ahead, education system needs to be spruced up, manufacturing sector needs to be boosted, you need to provide encouragement to the job creators in the economy rather than job seekers. Only then will the economic setup be in a positive manner. So overall, in this particular topic, what is it that we have seen? The basic psychology of opulence. Why is it that rich people, they tend to spend so much? What was Veblen's idea? That they have to spend to such an extent to create a gap so that other people of the society cannot emulate them and they are held distinctly. Then the poor population, they are trapped in that mindset, and that is when the rich also get that feeling that they deserve so. So while it is good for a developed economy, it can encourage capital creation, but for a developing economy, it can lead to grievances. That is where the social responsibility owed by these uber rich, that needs to be done much more visibly. They need to carry out these social sector activities in a much more and a larger scale and a much more perceivable manner. Then what are the causes for the rise of inequality and the cause for concern because of the rising inequality? Now think about what are the other factors due to which the inequality is rising in our country, and you can take the case of the other parts of the developing world as well. Put that in the comment section. Now then, coming to the next article. The next article is Stalked by Polio, Gaza faces another siege. This is also something which has appeared in page 6. It is relevant for your GS paper 2 as well as GS paper 3 because of polio. Now here, what is the pretext or the context of this article? While the article focuses on the fact that when you talk about any war, we talk about in terms of tangible outcomes of the war. That have the Israeli Defense Forces managed to capture or defeat the Hamas leadership, who has been captured, who has not been captured, how many casualties, etc. The tangibles are what the war focuses upon. But there are a lot of intangibles that the war stands to ignore many of the times. For example, and that is what the article argues, basically when we talk about any war, there is a significant amount of impact on the ecosystem, the environment. Otherwise, when you take a look at the people speaking on Global Forum for Biodiversity, they will always tell you how climate change and loss of biodiversity, these are some of the things which need to be prevented. But when you have a war, this is particularly kept in abeyance. So here, that is where the ecosystem gets destroyed. Ecosystem or ecology gets destroyed. Now, including biodiversity, etc. At the same time, there is a lot of pollution. You have chemical weapons which are used. You have various thermal weapons which are used. Now, the greenhouse gases which are emitted also lead to significant amount of global warming. So, environmental impact in the sense you have global warming which can be caused. Also, it is not only about bombing and the missile and the plane shows. It is also about the carbon footprint which is released when you have, or the carbon footprint associated with the movement of troops. Let's suppose the troops are one mechanized division. The armed forces, they have the infantry division, they have the armored corps, they have the mechanized division, etc. Let's suppose one strike corps is moving. It will have the infantry, it will have the tanks, it will have the military personnel protection vehicles, everything will be there. Now, when the entire unit moves, there's a lot of emission, there's a lot of carbon footprint associated, and that again degrades the environment. Large carbon footprint. But then, these are some of the associated factors or causes of concern in almost all the war. Here, what this article then tends to argue is the fact that the samples in the sewage lines in Gaza, these samples have found to be, or they have the presence of the polio virus. Now, polio virus is a deadly virus. The world is fighting a war, waging a war against the polio virus. While India has been successful in eliminating the scourge of polio virus, now largely it is restricted to the region of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Otherwise, the world has managed to eliminate that polio virus. Having said that, in Gaza and in the sewage system, you basically have the detection of the polio virus. So that becomes an impact of the war. How? Because when you talk about this polio virus, which is spreading in the region of Gaza, or which has been found in the sewage lines, this is not the kind of a wild polio virus that you find in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, or in certain areas of Africa. This is a different type of a polio virus. This is what is also regarded as the polio virus type 2, right? This is the polio virus type 2, which is referred to be the vaccine derived. That is, the people who have been administered the vaccine, they also have this virus. Now, on the side of the Israeli Defense Forces. The Israeli Defense Forces are saying that we are vaccinating the people in Gaza as well, and they have directed their troops not to drink the water from the local supplies. Rather, they would ensure that millions of bottles they are provided to the Israeli Defense Forces. Now at the same time, while the Israeli Defense Force, they are making the claim that we are administrating a lot of vaccines to the local population, one has to understand that the global reports, they indicate something which is different. The vaccination coverage pre-war in the region of Gaza was, for the polio virus, was considered to be 99%. Listen to this number again. Vaccination coverage pre-war was considered to be 99% for polio. Now that has reduced to around 89%. While it is still high, it is not as if it has fallen to 8%, but this 10% drop is massive. That in itself can mean hundreds and thousands of people, they will be deprived of this vaccine. Why? Because the hospitals, they are coming down. Hospitals are basically, there is a lot of bombardment and destruction even in the case of the hospitals. So that is why you will generally find that majority of the population is not able to even reach the hospital. So if they are unable to reach the hospital, and as of now the priority of the normal health checkup would obviously be in the backdrop because the war is going on. So if anybody is experiencing the early onset of these polio virus or the polio disease, that is not being reported. So due to this lack of hospitals, there is a lack of reportage. And lack of reportage means that this disease can slowly and steadily spread over. And you see, this disease spreads when you have the contaminated water. In the presence of contaminated water, this disease can easily spread. So that is where you have the presence in sewage water, means somebody or few sections of the population would already be impacted by polio virus. That is why it is present in the sewage lines. Due to war, further disruption in the impact of the availability of safe drinking water, etc., you can always have this virus spreading over. And this virus, by the way, is found to thrive only in the human body, human host. No other particular other animal hosts can propagate this polio virus. So the presence of polio virus in the sewage system in itself tells you that this is prevalently being found in the regions of the society of Gaza. Other than that, we also have to understand that even if, let's suppose, the war comes to an end, owing to the Iran clashes and the Iran tensions, that is something which is not foreseeable in the near time future, but let's assume the war comes to an end. Availability of clean drinking water supply, immunization against polio, these are the factors which are going to be the last on the priority list. The first items on the priority list are always going to be how to rehabilitate and how to basically ensure that the population gets back on its feet. So post-war rehabilitation also puts these factors at the very end of the priority table. So that is where diseases, they can virtually spread their wings, and all our effort across the world against polio virus, we are staring at a significant amount of a setback because of what is happening in Gaza. Because if it spreads, it can then perpetuate into the larger population. It can take decades for this situation to reverse itself. Okay, so in a nutshell, what does the article tell you? That war has got other impacts other than tangibles. What are the other impacts? Environmental, ecological, carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emission, and most dangerously, diseases. And on what basis are we saying that? Because the sewage lines in the region of Gaza have indicated the presence of polio virus, the type 1, not the other type virus which are present in the wild, but this is vaccine derived virus, right? So as a consequence of that, what happens is, or what can we conclude is, that sections of the society in Gaza have been suffering from polio virus. And because the hospitals are being destroyed, because you have the lower rate of immunization also, while the Israeli Defense Forces, they are providing vaccines and immunization to all the Israeli soldiers. But overall, for the population of Gaza, the rate of immunization is reducing. As the rate of immunization is reducing, there can be an increased spread of this polio virus to the larger sections of the vulnerable population. And that would mean decades of advances will take a step back. When the rehabilitation begins, at that point of time, the disease incidence, immunization programs, they are the last on the priority list. So that is why there is a cause of concern that it can perpetuate for the coming years and can take decades to get rid of this problem. Okay, what is the way forward? High time that Red Cross and other such organizations should step in, and you should have those particular health-based interregnum in terms of various different bombing activities, etc., which are happening, so that you can have the needy, the poor, they will be, or they should be provided with the required amount of vaccines. So you need international collaboration, increased vaccine supply for the next few years in the region of Gaza, and India, being famously referred to as the pharmacy of the world, can definitely lend a helping hand. Okay, so that can be cited as a way forward. Overall, if you have to write them or conceptualize them, so Red Cross, international organizations should step in. Then other than that, immunizations and health sector, immunizations and healthcare needs to recover as soon as possible. Recovery. Then countries like India can provide more vaccine. Like India can provide more vaccines. Okay, so these are some of the way forward that you can always cite. Now moving on into the third article. The third article is basically a summarization of the economic outlook or the economic scenario in the month of July. And it has been cited as election overhang. This is something again appeared in the page 6 of the newspaper, relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, what does this article talk about? This article mentions that when we talk about the core industries and the growth and the rise of the core industries, there the growth has been particularly lower. The growth has been stymied a bit. And that is attributed to various factors. One of the factors attributing to the lack of or reduction of growth, please understand, reduction of growth is different from contraction. Certain sectors have observed contraction also, but majority of the sectors have basically witnessed reduction in growth. So the growth is still there, not at the same rate. So here, what are the factors influencing the growth? We will take a look at it. But before that, one thing we have to understand is for the past few years now, India's growth has largely been, for any particular country or any particular economy, the growth is dependent on certain key pillars. One is the development, or let's suppose the investment by the government into infrastructure building, into healthcare supply, etc. So when the government invests, that creates ancillary investment and demand in the market also, and that is good for the economy. And then you have the private sector investment. Let's suppose the private sector opens up a new industry that will create more jobs and that will create demand. So you have public investment and private investment. These are the two engines which drive the growth of the country. In India's case, for the past few years, India's growth is largely dependent only on the public investment. That is the spending by the government. The private sector investment has been quite restricted, to say the least. So here, when you have growth, that is public sector, public investment driven growth. Right. Now here, basically, during the past few months, you had the election season, and during the time of the election season, many of the projects were not implemented at the same pace because the election season was a long one involving a lot of political capital and a lot of time for various different leaders associated. So due to which you did not have enough amount of investments which happened. Many of the projects were not followed up, due to which the overall public expenditure, the expenditure in creation of capital assets, investment in infrastructure, etc., that has slowed down. So that public investment slowed. Why did it slow? Due to inflation. Due to the factor of inflation. Or not inflation, rather election. Due to the election process, that is where the public investment slowed down. But other than that, now this had its impact in various areas. For example, when the public investment slows down, infrastructure activities, they come to a slight slower speed. Now infrastructure, if there is investment in infrastructure, which are the sectors which benefit out of it? Whenever you invest, let's suppose 1 rupee or 100 rupees in infrastructure, you will directly end up boosting certain industries such as, for example, cement, such as electricity generation, You will also end up boosting the construction sector. Mind you, construction sector, here also steel, very direct benefit, or one of those sectors which benefits when the infrastructure progresses. So construction sector is one of the largest employment generating sectors in our country. So slowing down infrastructure growth has directly impacted these industries. Electricity, however, indicated a moderate outlook because of a greater amount of production in certain areas. Now, even though electricity could not register a growth significantly, but coal, on the other hand, registered a significant or a massive growth. Electricity, you also have to understand that the previous quarter's electricity utilization, if it is indicating month to month slightly slowing down of electricity output in the month of June, that is because the monsoon rains have provided some amount of relief, due to which the peak demand for electricity has slightly reduced in the economy. Now, this is one of the factors why these sectors have not indicated a particular growth. Now, construction sector impacts the larger population also. Now here, steel, if let's suppose there is a demand for steel can be created by which sectors? Manufacturing, particularly automobiles, locomotives, shipbuilding, etc. Other than that, infrastructure. They can create a huge demand for steel. Now, while infrastructure is slowing down, it slowed down in the previous months because of the election process. So, the steel sector did not have that much of a demand. And if steel sector does not have that much of a demand, again that takes a hit on employment numbers. And other sector which does benefit significantly from steel is the construction. Any kind of construction will use will have the utility of steel. So here, the slowing of the construction sector is also being, one of the reasons being touted for that is basically extreme heat waves. Extreme heat wave conditions. You have the extreme heat waves, and these extreme heat waves have really slowed down the efficiency and the output of the larger population, due to which the construction sector is slowing down, due to which again you have the cascading impact. What does this tell you? This tells you that now climate change is no longer a theoretical exercise restricted to the academia or the academic books. Now when you talk about climate change, it has got a direct tangible impact on our economic outcome as well. Having said that, the Producers Manufacturing Index, which tells you the sentiment of the producer or the manufacturing community in large. Now that PMI index, that is what is known as the Purchasing Managers Index. Managers Index, PMI. This tells you the overall sentiment of the manufacturers in the market, in the economy. Now this PMI number has also slightly softened. From the PMI number in June, it was 58.3. Now in the month of July, it is indicated to be 58.1. Now, PMI number, for those of us who don't know about it, this tells you about whether the economy is actually in expansionary phase, recessionary phase, or contracting. And how do you get that? So, various different organizations release that. For example, HSBC. Now, what they do, they take a survey, and the various different manufacturers, they are advised or they are requested to fill the survey and certain set of questions in terms of the new demand order, how much new demand or new orders have been placed on them. So if more orders are being placed, means what? Economy is expanding, the number of jobs created. If more jobs are generated, again what? Demand is increasing, right? The market sentiment. So they capture the market sentiment in such a way to gauge an idea whether there is an expansionary phase of the economy or whether the economy is in a recessionary phase. So when you have the PMI greater than 50, means what? You have an expanding economy. Expanding economy. Now this PMI, even though in June it has softened, but it is still 58.1, indicates to you that the economy is still very robust. Having said that, this month's PMI also notes one unique characteristic. And that unique characteristic being noted is the fact that when we talk about the overall input cost, the input cost is very high. The input cost faced by the manufacturers, that input cost is increasing owing to logistical supply issues, owing to the geopolitical war which is going on across the world. So the input cost, be it coal, be it steel, everything that is high. So due to the high inflation, the overall manufacturing sector can suffer going ahead into the future. So while we know what is the reason for the decline in the economic activity, that needs to be spruced up and gained back again very quickly so as to ensure that the economy overall continues to grow at a healthy, robust rate. Now that the elections are over, again the focus needs to be put back on the growth engines of the economy, that is infrastructure, construction, etc. Okay? Now, after that, the next article. This is Balancing Competition and Sustainability for India. This is again something which has appeared in page 7, part of GS paper 3. Now this is a unique article which talks about the aspect of competition in the economy and at the same time balancing it with the concept of sustainability. So when we talk about competition in the economy, let's suppose you have two firms, A and B. Let us declutter this entire article, otherwise this article, when prima facie, when you read it, it can be slightly difficult to understand. So let us break it down, simplify it. Let's consider two firms, A and B. Now in the economy, in the market, to ensure that whether they are following ethical practices or not, or just in order to gain undue advantage of market share or undue greater access to the market, they are not doing any kind of nefarious or unscrupulous activities. That is why you have the requirement of managing competition in the economy. In India, you have the Competition Commission of India, CCI, which is responsible for that. isn't it? That everybody basically takes ethical decisions, logical, reasonable decisions, so that just in order to win the competition, they should not ensure that they carry out any illegal or activities which are outside the ambit of the law. So that is basically the role of CCI, to ensure healthy competition, competing environment which is conducive for all the players, not only A or not only B, conducive for all the players. In the market. Okay, so that level playing ground is maintained. Everybody has got equal opportunity, more or less, in a nutshell. Now, where does the factor of sustainability come in here? So the very basic concept of this is that when we talk about, let's suppose, climate change has already dawned upon us. The realities are in front of us. Now this climate change has got a lot of impacts. Now what does that require is, when we talk about large corporations, large organizations, they also need to produce in a reasonable manner. They also need to carry out the functions in a very just manner, justified manner. Whatever they are producing, what is the environmental impact? Isn't it? So when we talk about the entire aspect of sustainability here, first of all, there has to be responsible production by the organizations. That is, they are keeping a track of what are the environmental challenges, what are the various environmental impacts, etc. They are keeping a track of that. Now, when we say this responsible production, here, it can also happen. Let's suppose you consider two organizations. One is Pepsi, one is Coca-Cola. Both of these are large conglomerates, large organizations. Now both of them are given a directive that by the government of the day, that you have to carry out sustainable production, you have to ensure that the carbon footprint is lowered, emissions are not there, etc., etc. Both of them have various different regulations that they have to keep in mind for a safe environment. Now it can always happen in a kind of a world which is not regulated. It can always happen that Pepsi basically adopts some of these practices but circumvents the other part of the law in order to make their product cheaper. How? Let me elaborate. For example, let's suppose they are manufacturing soda in a can or in a bottle. Now they might meet regulations in terms of production, but in terms of transportation, in terms of packaging, if let's suppose they are bringing all the eco-friendly activities in place and the processes in place, their cost of production might go very high. So in order to limit the cost of the product, they might circumvent some of the environmental norms, isn't it? Now Coca-Cola also wants to keep its price of the product low. So in order to achieve that low price, they might go for certain shortcuts, because overall what do they require? They require their products to be of a very low price, which is competitive, isn't it? Lower price, which is competitive. Now in order to attain that lower price, in order for carrying out that competition, they might violate the environmental norms. Okay, so that will go against the very DNA of sustainability. How will you be able to sustain? It can also happen that various companies in the same sector, they might collude with each other. That, okay, you also violate these norms, I will also violate these norms. Let us ensure that we keep the product price down, and overall, the entire sector is something which is accountable only for two of us. So that is where what the article argues, that to ensure that sustainability is maintained, at the same time no company goes for that circumvention of the law for production, and that there is responsible production in the economy which is ensured. The need of the hour is basically that the Competition Commission of India in itself or the government should come out with certain guidelines for sustainability, so that the various different organizations, institutes, etc., the various different companies, they are required to follow those guidelines. Okay, so here what the article talks about is that, let's suppose we talk about CCI or SEBI. SEBI already has issued certain guidelines for sustainability, right? Or the government should issue guidelines. Should issue guidelines. Guidelines for what? Guidelines for responsible production. And responsible production, why do you need to carry out? To ensure sustainability. Sustainability. Okay, so that no one, in the name of competition, no one circumvents or contravenes the law. Now, there are other successful examples across the globe as well. For example, in Japan, when you have the Anti-Monopoly Act, that Anti-Monopoly Act talks about the fact that most activities seeking environmental sustainability are unlikely to restrict competition. That is the assumption which is made by the Act. Right, so the activities have pro-competitive effects, and that might result in consumer benefits, in the sense that eventually, let's suppose company A, while researching for these eco-friendly purposes and eco-friendly methods of production, company A has come up with a very innovative packaged product, or let's suppose packaging tool or a packaging material. And let's suppose due to that, company B also innovates and comes up with a different kind of a material, a different kind of a product. Now, in that case, what do you have? Newer innovations coming to the market. Who benefits at the end of it? Eventually, it will be the consumer. So rather than having a scenario where the companies are encouraged to flout the norms, let us create the condition where the companies are forced to innovate without flouting the norms to benefit the consumer at large. Same is the case with UK as well and EU as well. In the case of EU, unless and until you have any organization which is destroying the environment directly, right, and they are maintaining or ensuring sustainable practices, that is allowed. So sustainability is put at the forefront. In the case of UK, Competition and Market Authorities, they have launched a market study into the electric vehicle charging sector. Why? So as to ensure the development of competition alongside innovation. There is knowledge sharing, etc. Right? So all this is to do or carry out a kind of a responsible production. So in a nutshell, let us summarize what we have studied in the article and what that article wants to convey. The article conveys to you, first of all, that climate change and environmental damage is a reality, what we have been observing in Wayanad as well, and ecological damage is a reality. Okay, this is a first fact. Now, here, as a solution, industries need to cooperate. Okay, now when we say the industries need to cooperate here, that would mean what? Responsible production. Responsible production. Responsible production as in carry out environmental impact assessment, carbon footprint study, etc. Footprint study, etc. Right, whatever you are producing. Now, what is in the way of this? Obstacle. What is the obstacle in this? Obstacle is that increased competition in the market is one of the obstacles. Competition in the market, right? That will give rise to a tendency to flout norms or flout as in violate environmental norms. Okay. What will this lead to? Violation of environmental norms will lead to destruction of the ecosystem. So what is needed? Ideally, in order to ensure that there is responsible production, what do you need? You need all companies, all players to follow guidelines for protection and conservation or conservation of environment, right? They need to follow the guidelines. Now, here, all the players following guidelines, how will you ensure that someone is not flouting the norms? Can be initiated CCI, Competition Commission comes into the picture, can lay basic guidelines, right? That guidelines and those guidelines for environmental conservation needs to be followed by everyone, right? Then what will be achieved? You will have a kind of sustainable growth, cooperation within the industry, inter and intra industry cooperation, and also eventually benefit to the consumer, and that benefit to consumer is going to lead to responsible consumption. You will not be consuming many of the microplastics or plastic products used in production processes, etc. And overall, the ecological damage can be mitigated or managed. So this is the mind map for this entire article, which is slightly complicated to understand. That is why I have decluttered it in the form of this mind map. Okay. I hope you have understood this topic in detail now, because this is one of the areas where again you have a direct interlinkage between the economy and the portion of climate change. Now, what do scientists make of the budget? Now, this is an article which has basically appeared in page 8 of the newspaper, relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, while this article talks about the various different people in the Ministry of Science and Technology, or the Department of Science and Technology, as well as few of the other scientists from other walks of life, now they have put their opinion forward with regards to what is there in the budget, or how do they infer this budget in terms of the development of science and technology and that particular area in our country. Rather than looking into the push, the pull, etc., what someone has said in favor or against, let us again extract the key arguments here. So when we talk about the key positives that have been indicated in this article with association with the budget for the science and tech sector, here some of the key positives that have been highlighted which will benefit the science and technology sector, and research and development ecosystem will be further boosted as per the announcements of this year's budget. Then we will take a look at the key challenges which still confront us. So here the budget has focused quite significantly on the climate resilient agriculture, and that is where you have various different programs such as more crops per drop and also growth of millets. These are the kind of programs which have received significant amount of a boost. Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana, that is the aspect of natural farming, all those areas are significantly boosted under this year's budget. So that is a key positive. There is increased research also being carried out in terms of various different crops such as maize, such as varieties of rice, chickpeas, grams, etc., in order to ensure better yield and more regeneration within the year. So that is always good. That is a good area of investment in science and tech, which will end up benefiting the agricultural sector. Agricultural sector has got a great amount of impact due to climate change. Then miniature and modular nuclear technology. For that, you have the Bharat reactors, for which there has been allocation, significant amount of budgetary allocations. Now, this has got the ability and the future possibility to be able to generate self-sufficiency in energy sector for us. And not only that, we can be the pioneers of the world in terms of the miniature nuclear reactors. For civilian and peaceful purposes, these reactors can then be provided to other various different poor countries and the countries of global south. So that is where there is a huge opportunity lying ahead in this sector. So it is good to see that the government has announced the significant outlay under this area. That is what the article argues. Then there has been investment in the critical minerals and the easing of norms for the mining of the critical minerals as well. Now these critical minerals, they are important. Why? When we talk about the renewables, when we talk about electric vehicles, battery technology is going to be the driver of that. Now for batteries, you need what? You need the availability of critical minerals, isn't it? So for that, for those mining purposes, recently you have had another 1600 tons of lithium deposits discovered in the Mandya region of Karnataka. So like that, critical minerals, if they are mined, explored and extracted at a much more efficient way and in a much larger number, that can have a good impact on our economic and renewable development going ahead. Allocation under ANRF, that is Anusandhan National Research Foundation. This is to inculcate research at the institutional level. It is a different matter altogether that the announcement of establishment of Anusandhan National Research Foundation was something which was done 5 years back. But then, owing to the COVID pandemic, etc., this had been perpetually delayed. So now that there is a budgetary outlay and a budgetary allocation to this, it is a good sign. That means research at the institutional level, institutions, right? So research at institutional levels of institutions. That will be promoted. Then the government has also announced the plug and play industrial parks, where you will have the required infrastructure, you will have the required facilities, and you can have some of the industrial, the large industrial park will be created, where you can have various industries as per their requirement. Whatever is the need, they can basically carry out the work there. Now that will bring about a greater sharing of technology, creation of an ecosystem, and development of technological prowess in the manufacturing sector. So that is also deemed as a positive. Abolition of angel tax, and at the same time, when we say abolition of angel tax, that basically means what? that you have an increased investment done in the, or possibility of investment in the startup sector. Angel tax is imposed on whom, or would be imposed on whom? Anybody who would invest in, let's suppose, a new startup, the angel investor. Now a tax was imposed on them. Now when you have the abolition of angel tax, means that would attract greater investment in the startups, and along with that you have a simultaneous announcement of increased budgetary outlay in the space sector, for space technology, for biotech as well. So that means you would have increased number of these startups and the VC firms also investing in these startups, which will have a tremendous potential to generate research, cutting edge technological prowess, and at the same time multiple different utilities in the global market. So these are some of the positives. But at the same time, there are certain key challenges which still confront us. Regardless of how many positives we look at, there are certain key challenges which do not, or which persistently have not allowed for the growth of the science and tech or the research and development sector in our country. One of that is, every budget, there's a kind of a minimal increase in terms of allocation for research, development, science and tech. Now, on the paper, that might seem to be varying from one year to another. But the reality of the matter is that if you take a very long look back into our budgetary allocation, research and development is one of those areas where it is not always the case that if I have allocated 100 rupees, all the 100 rupees are utilized. It can be the case that if I have allocated 100 rupees, only 60 rupees eventually have been used up. 40 rupees have not even been picked up from the government side. Right? So there is a gross amount of misutilization, huge amount of misutilization. So when you talk about the minimal increase in allocation, when you count in, let's suppose, the factor of inflation, with factor of inflation, you will see that this increase in allocation is almost negligible. Now it might be larger than the last year, it might be greater than the year before that also, but what are we actually targeting? We have to target close to around 5% of our budgetary allocation, 4 to 5% of our budgetary allocation to the R&D sector. We are nowhere close to that. One of the problems is that in our case, large amount of allocation is through the public expenditure itself, that is the government funds. Whereas when you take a look at the developed economies who are doing well in terms of research and development, that investment is happening from the side of the private investment as well. So that is not happening in our country. Then ARNF, that is the Anusandhan Research National Foundation that you are talking about, still to be operational 5 years since the announcement. The announcement was made a long time back and still it is not operational. So it is not as if from first year itself this institute will start delivering results. It will have its own lag. It will take its own time period. Then seeking of quality reports every quarter. Now what does that mean? Every quarter you basically seek these reports. What is the need for that? Or what does this mean? So basically, when the government allocates, let's suppose, 100 rupees to any particular institute to carry out a research, the government seeks these quarterly reports. Now the quarterly reports are basically in the form of tangibles, that this money was given for which purpose, what have you achieved in these months, and what do you seek to achieve. While prima facie it is good for accountability, it is good for maintaining transparency and ensure that there is no misutilization of funds. But at the same time, you also have to understand that science and technology and research and development, it is not as if it will always have a particular set targeted result. For example, if I am studying material chemistry, let's suppose I am researching on certain materials. Now those materials can have the impact in space travel also. those newer materials can have an impact in better drug delivery also. Newer materials can have an impact on, let's suppose, better heat exchange in electrical engines and other internal combustion engines. That can increase the efficiency in the vehicles. So one research can have multiple unforeseen outcomes. All of them can have various different impact. So that is why this quarterly report which is sought oftentimes ends up being an impediment in terms of utilization of the funds. So because if you don't show anything, next tranche of funds won't be released. So this is where the institutes need to be given with a certain amount of autonomy. The legacy institutes at least, that okay, I have given you this much amount of fund, now you ensure that from your institute I get some quality result outcomes. Okay, these are some of the main key challenges indicated in the article. But here when we talk about the development of science and tech and research and development, what is the way forward? First is, let's suppose, smoothing of the production linked incentive scheme. Now, various different organizations, companies under the PLI scheme, they are in a way encouraged to produce more. And when they are encouraged to produce more, there is a 2 lakh crore corpus allocated for them. Now, in this particular case, when you have this PLI scheme directed towards increased production but also increasing production in an efficient manner, that is when technological advancements can happen. Then attract private funds for R&D, for research and development, very important. You need to provide institutional grants to the various different institutes to carry out the research. You can basically have a transparent mechanism, a competition, healthy competition between the number of patents filed every year, the number of research papers. While this is being maintained, but in the name of ensuring that a particular institute has, let's suppose, has to top the chart, they file some unscrupulous or not required patents, etc. So that weeding out process has to happen. The institute, let's suppose you provide them with some kind of enticement, some kind of encouragement that the institutes which have filed required and reasonable research papers, they are given better accreditation, they are given better funds, provide internship to the students who are carrying out the study in the research and development and science and technology. You provide them with certain incentives so that nobody is forced to pick up a job and leave that research area. Allow them to carry out the research. For that, institutes need to be made more autonomous and they need to be encouraged on the same. Okay? Now, here you can have a practice question. Discuss the reasons for stymied research and development ecosystem for India. Suggest a way forward. So in this, in the introduction, what do you have to talk about? Introduction, you have to talk about the fact that how research and development forms a backbone for any country's progress and further or future pathway. This creates new avenues for technological advancement, but at the same time creating new jobs and bolstering and further boosting the economy. After this introduction, talk about the reasons for the factor why research and development is not doing particularly good. Low budgetary allocation, lack of industry to institute connect, all the discussions that we have had even in the past week, that is something that you can highlight. And then eventually talk about, because it is a 15-marker question, you also have to talk about what can be done. Here, you also have to mention what is it that the government is doing. So while the government already is ensuring this by allocation of more budgetary allocation in the critical minerals, climate resilient agriculture, more needs to be done. That is what you talk about. And then in the conclusion, talk about in a way forward manner. Going ahead, it is important to inculcate that research and development and the importance of that sector in the mindset of the tiny tots, so that the demography, which is youthful as of now, when it grows up, that yields India the real dividend and India can progress ahead. Like that, you can conclude the answer. Okay? Now, as in Kerala, local climate processes can worsen climate extremes. Now, what does this article talk about? In a nutshell, in a very brief, this article talks about the fact that while we talk about climate change, any and every incident which happens, cloudburst happens, we say climate change. Floods happen, we say climate change. Heat waves happen, we say climate change. Landslides happen, we say climate change. Everything we attribute to climate change. But then, how is climate change leading to cloudburst? Why only climate change is leading to cloudburst in certain areas? How is climate change leading to that heat wave and that excess rainfall followed? So that key important piece of information is actually missing. So that is where this article, which has appeared in the science section of the newspaper, last page, the science section relevant for your GS paper 3. This article talks about the fact that global modeling or simulation models are available, where at a global scale now you will have the ability to predict El Nino, La Nina, Indian Ocean dipole, etc. That predictability has come. But all the global atmospheric events or climatic events, oftentimes they get exaggerated by local climatic variations. So that is why there is a need for a greater research, a greater understanding of these local variations and an understanding of how these local variations can exaggerate the impact of climate change. So for example, this article argues that why is it that when we say that the government has issued a warning, there's a lot of controversy going around this fact also that the government had basically issued a warning to the state of Kerala and that was not heeded to. Now, oftentimes the warnings can be very generic, that water level will rise. But to what extent? So we need to have specified warnings also. So that talks about better development of the local research models, that how the local climate is changing. For example, here the article has given the example of the region of Western Ghats. The article talks about the fact that as you have the winds crossing the equator and coming towards India during the monsoon season, they pick up a lot of moisture, right? Now, here, near the coastline, their behavior suddenly changes. How does the behavior change? Now, they face an obstruction in the coastline in the form of Western Ghats. Western Ghats being very steep. So, these winds, they sense that obstruction in the sense that they face that obstruction and they slow down. So, when the winds slow down, that is when there is basically less evaporation which happens, isn't it? There's a kind of wind slow down here. Winds slow down. As the winds slow down, there is less evaporation from the seas. How is it the case? Because when you have evaporation anywhere or any wind moving anywhere, evaporation is accelerated. For example, you take a piece of a wet cloth, you keep it out in the balcony with very strong winds, immediately the cloth will dry, isn't it? So greater the wind speed, more is the evaporation. But when the wind slows down, less evaporation from the sea. Evaporation is a mechanism by which the sea surface lowers itself. The temperature is lowered. The sea surface cools itself by evaporation. So here, if the evaporation is less cooling of the sea surface. Cooling of sea surface. That means the sea surface in the coastal area accumulates heat. Sea surface in coastal regions, areas accumulate heat. As they accumulate heat, they create intense low pressure systems right near the coastline. Create intense low pressure systems. These low pressure systems are created near the coastline. And as these low pressure systems are created near the coastlines, means what? Will attract more winds. Low pressure systems always attract winds. So when you have more low pressure systems created, more winds are attracted, winds are pulled. And these winds, they are coming over from the region of Indian Ocean, carrying a lot of moisture, large moisture, volume of moisture is carried, isn't it? Now, this large volume of moisture will bring what? Huge amount of rainfall in a small time period, or maybe events of cloudburst, hailstorms, etc. And when those happen in the critical habitat of Western Ghats, that can always induce landslides. So here, bring or cause very heavy rains or cloudburst, and this can cause landslides. So basically, what do you observe here is that the local condition of the coastal water, that in itself has instigated all these events, all these actions. Now what does that tell us? That we need to study these local conditions and carry out the modeling procedures of the local conditions much more. While we talk about the international modeling systems, they are up to a standard, and every year you have increased amount of more research and verification and sanitization of the data which is done. That is, non-utilizable data is removed, is weeded off, etc. So we need to carry out more local based research here and understand that if, let's suppose, 2 centimeters of rainfall more has happened, what will be the impact in terms of landslides? What will be the impact in terms of flood? And for that, what do you need? You need almost a decade or so future predictability. Future prediction going ahead for more than a decade or so. Only in that case will you be able to ensure that, okay, this is the climate model that I was expecting, this is what has happened. That is why the situation has gotten worse. Now, the ability to predict in future for almost a decade will require the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, that will cheapen the cost of this procedure quite significantly. But at the same time, this will provide a kind of a direct linkage with the impact of climate and disaster, so that we can be able to prevent the disaster. Let's suppose you have today got an information that 30th of August something bad is going to happen in this region. 30th of August. Now you have enough time to evacuate the people from that region, enough time to provide the rescue professionals in that area, so that when, let's suppose, the disaster unfolds, loss of life and property is not a major concern. So that is basically why we need to have better modeling systems and local weather modeling systems to be in place. And for that, we need a better research again in the local areas where that low pressure system is getting created. Why cloudbursts are only concentrated in certain areas of Uttarakhand, not across Uttarakhand? Why only in certain areas of Himachal? We need to carry out a proper study in an empirical evidence form that this much rise of temperature means this much more moisture brought to Indian subcontinent, means these are the areas where cloudbursts can happen on these days. Right? If you have a generic warning that Western Ghats can experience landslides, where will you evacuate? How many will you evacuate? So that is why, in order to ensure disaster mitigation, rather than after the disaster managing that disaster, that the casualty number should be brought down, disaster prevention is the way to go. And how do we prevent that disaster? Better forecast, better ability to go back and go ahead into the future and have data pointers. Okay? Now, in order to achieve zero casualties, the country has to move from disaster management to disaster mitigation. Commit. Now, in this article, 10 marker, how will you introduce? So in the introduction, you have to talk about that India is one of those countries which experiences substantial loss of life and property every year due to various climate-induced disasters. These disasters range from floods to landslides to avalanches to slips, mud flow, etc., cloudburst, hailstorms. That will be your introduction. Then in the body you talk about that disaster when it occurs. After that, management or ensuring that there is a lesser loss, damage, etc., puts us in a kind of a repetitive cycle where after every disaster we are left with the woeful task of counting the dead. In order to prevent that, there can only be one mechanism. And what is that? Prevention of disaster. How will that happen? Talk about that how will we be able to, so we will have to go for the local monitoring of the weather systems, the development of the local simulation models for studying the weather systems, preparing a forecast data for the next decade or so, and ensuring the validation of those data pointers with the global prediction models. And that is how we will be able to have a direct co-linkage between the aspects of climate and the realities or the impact of disaster. Okay, like that you can write the answer. Now, coming to a couple of articles relevant for your prelims. So, Supreme Court asks banks to find MSME stress before the accounts turn to non-performing assets. So, what this is about is basically the Supreme Court has asked the various different banks that look at the financial condition of the MSME accounts so that in proper time intervention can be made rather than raising an alarm when they turn into an NPA. So, what is an NPA is what we will study here. So, what is an NPA? NPA is a non-performing asset, is a kind of a loan or an advance for which the principal or the interest payment has not been done for 3 months. That is what is a non-performing asset, right? But before, when we talk about any asset to be declared as an NPA, there also you have a subcategorization that is relevant for your prelims. So NPAs are further subclassified into substandard assets, doubtful assets, and loss assets. Substandard assets, assets which have remained as non-performing for the period of 12 months, less than or equal to 12 months, they are substandard assets. Doubtful asset is doubtful if it has remained in the substandard category for a period of entire year. So initially NPA for a period which is less or equal to 1 year, then an asset which is in substandard category for 1 year is doubtful, and loss asset is considered uncollectible of such little value that its continuance as a bankable asset is not warranted. Right, so you don't expect any collection out of it. So this is the subclassification of the NPA. So here for your prelims, what is an NPA? That period of 90 days, and then the substandard, doubtful, and loss-making assets. Okay, the last article. Philippines and Germany have basically agreed to broaden the defense agreement. Now this is to ward off the Chinese threat in the region of the Western Pacific, and this is also seen as a direct intervention by a European power again into what was considered to be the Quad's resistance to the Chinese ingress in the region of South China Sea. So that is something which the world is actually looking upon, and this has got the potential to materialize into defense relationship going ahead and defense weapons being exchanged going ahead into the future. Okay, so that is where we'll restrict the discussion here for today. I hope the discussion has been productive and positive for you. Do try to write the answers, and also where I have asked you for the reasons and the solutions for the rising inequality, provide that in the comment section below. If you have liked the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again tomorrow, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.